welcome to JudgeCast. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Perlman, and I'm joined this evening, afternoon, morning drive to work by the one and only Charles Feather.
Hello, hello.
And the one and only Marco Sanchez.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, and this is episode 4 in our ongoing series where we've partnered with Judge Foundry to create a series of videos designed to help Magic players learn what is necessary to become L1 judges.
Yep, big thank you to our sponsor for this episode and series, Judge Foundry. Judge Foundry is a membership-based, nonprofit organization serving the U.S. and Canada in providing certifications for tabletop gaming officials. They manage everything to do with obtaining and maintaining your certification, and provide educational resources like this one to ensure that every Judge Foundry certified judge has the knowledge and skills to be successful. When it comes to running Magic events at your local game store or at a larger international convention, Judge Foundry is a great resource for you to certify your skills. For more information on Judge Foundry, visit judgefoundry.org and click on the orange Become a Judge button to find out how you can earn your level. The link is in the description below. And now on to today's topic.
This episode will expand on the rules around the zones in Magic. Here we're going to focus on what a level 1 judge working F&M or scheduled events at a larger event should know. Not every corner case of zones is explored, but if you wish to go deeper or explore topics faster than these videos come out, you can delve into our extensive library at judgecast.com or search us up in your podcast app of choice. Our podcasts are typically at least an hour, so you get both a more detailed discussion, humor, insight, and of course our mellifluous effusions.
Every object in the game of Magic has to be in a place. It might be in the hand or on the play surface, but it needs to be somewhere, and that somewhere needs to be defined. The list of somewheres are library, hand, battlefield, graveyard, stack, exile, command, and, well, ante. But that's only for the completionist. We really don't concern ourselves with ante anymore.
Zones are split up by quote-unquote public zones and quote-unquote private zones. Public zones are ones where players can see the card faces, except where modified by other rules. Private zones are where at least some and maybe all of the players are generally not allowed to see the faces of the cards. The public zones are graveyard, battlefield, stack, exile, and technically ante, even though it's not really a thing that we care about at all. The private zones are library and hand. A zone doesn't change the categorization, even if all cards in that zone are revealed or hidden. Your hand is still a private zone, even if you have to reveal its contents to your opponent.
There are playmats that you've probably seen with specific areas marked for zones. Their markings just denote a common convention, not a required place. They're nice if you like everything in a clean labeled space, but the location of each zone is mostly up to you as long as it's understandable to both players. Now, on to the specifics. So everyone has a deck, right? What's the difference between your deck and your library? Presentation! Yes, you weren't expecting a Megamind reference, were you? When a game begins, each player's deck becomes their library.
Each library must be kept in a single face-down pile. You can't look at or change the order of cards in a library unless directed to by another spell or effect. In fact, even when you are searching your library for a card, the order of the cards don't change while you are searching. This can cause some weird corner cases that we might talk about if we were to ever do an L3 version of these videos. If a player is told to put 2 or more cards in a specific position in the library at the same time, and not told how to put them there, the owner of the cards gets to determine the order, and they don't have to reveal that order.
So as an example, if I cast Plow Under, targeting Charles's lands, Charles gets to decide their order, and they don't have to tell me the order, even though the wording of the card seems to strongly imply that I'm the one doing the putting. Another example to kind of drive this point home is if you draw 3 cards with Brainstorm, and the first card is an Entreat the Angels, and you reveal it. When you put the 2 cards back, the opponent will know if you put the Entreat the Angels back, but they won't know if it's the top card or the second card.
If an effect tells you to put a card let's say 7th from the top, and your library has fewer than 7 cards in it, you put the card on the bottom. Some effects tell a player to play with the top card revealed, or say you can look at the top card of their library at any time. If the top card of the library somehow changes while a spell is being cast, different from resolving, but if it's cast, or an ability is being activated, the new top card won't be revealed and can't be looked at until the spell is finished being cast or the ability is finished being activated.
For example, if you play the top card of your library with Bolas Citadel, you can't look at the new top card of the library in the middle of casting the first spell. You have to make all of your decisions before you know what the next card is. Chromatic Sphere is another card where this rule comes up as the new card is part of the mana ability, which can be activated in the middle of casting a spell. In that case, you don't get to look at the top card drawn until you are done casting the spell.
There are 2 other items with respect to, quote, effects that tell a player to play with the top card revealed, unquote, that may be relevant. When you draw multiple cards, each of those draws are separate, and the new top card is briefly revealed before it is drawn. And if the top card is revealed, and that specific card stops being revealed for any length of time before being revealed again, it is a new object.
The next zone is named after the villains in the Daredevil comics, the Hand. The Hand is where players hold the cards that they have drawn. I know, right? Other effects can also put cards into players' hands. Each player has a maximum hand size, which is normally 7, but effects can change that. You may go above your max hand size during your turn or other players' turns. However, as part of the cleanup step at the end of your turn, you're going to need to discard down to your maximum hand size. Much to the dismay of judges everywhere, you can rearrange cards in your hand at any time. Please don't have it take the form of flicking your cards. This isn't a rule, it's just an obnoxious habit. Opponents can't look at cards in your hand, but they are allowed to count them at any time.
So let's talk about the battlefield. Yeah, my favorite zone. The battlefield is the area between the players, and typically physically the largest. The battlefield starts out empty. Permanents a player controls are on the battlefield and typically in front of the permanent's controller, but they don't have to be. Orders you cast on your opponent's creatures may be on their side of the battlefield, attached to their creature. But this placement is more a convention than a rule. Permanents only exist on the battlefield. Every object on the battlefield is a permanent. Spells or abilities check and affect only the battlefield unless it specifically mentions a player or zone, or reference an object that can only exist in a certain zone. Exile target creature only looks on the battlefield, and not the graveyard. Exile target creature card in a graveyard will only look in the graveyard. Counter target spell will only look on the stack. Whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, it becomes a new object with no relation to any version of its previous self, with some exceptions we'll cover in a bit.
Now on to the graveyard. The graveyard is a player's discard pile. Any object that is countered, discarded, destroyed, or sacrificed is put on top of the owner's graveyard, as is any instant or sorcery that is finished resolving. Each player's graveyard is a single face-up pile, despite how some players may fan it out or spread it out. Each player can examine the cards in a graveyard at any time, but technically can't change the order. However, Wizards of the Coast did explicitly stop making cards that care about the order of cards in your graveyard a very long time ago. So this graveyard order rule really only applies to formats that allow really old cards like Legacy, Vintage, and technically Commander. Now, the way we all play this is anybody who's running a card like Bone Dancer, for example, that cares about graveyard order should let everybody else at the table know that they're playing a card that cares about graveyard order, because a lot of times we might want to move things around in our graveyard. That's usually fine unless it's not, in which case you need to tell who you're playing with that it's not. If an effect or rule, like a board wipe, puts 2 or more cards into the graveyard at the same time, the owner of those cards can arrange them in any order.
All right. The stack is probably one of the hardest to visualize zones. It is the zone that helps us keep track of the order of spells and abilities that need to resolve. Each time an object is put on the stack, it's put on the top of all other objects there. When a spell is cast, the physical card is put on the stack. When an ability is activated or triggered, it goes on the stack, although it doesn't have a physical card to represent it. On the stack, each spell has all the characteristics, that's rules, color, mana value, etc., of the card associated with it. Activated and triggered abilities only have the text of the ability that created it and no other characteristics. When we start talking about like damage and sources and stuff like that, we'll go into how that can be. But for right now, it doesn't have any other characteristics.
It helps to think of the stack as a stack of pancakes, and you have to eat the pancake on top before you can get to the ones below it. If 2 or more objects would go on the stack at the same time, we put all objects controlled by the active player first, then followed by all objects in turn order. If a single player controls multiple objects going on the stack at the same time, that player chooses the order. This is probably the most important rule and comes up in Commander a lot. Let's create a nightmare situation where you are playing against all 3 Judge Cast hosts, and each one of us has a Rhystic Study, and you cast a spell on your turn. We put them on the stack in app-nap order, which would be active player, non-active player in 1v1, or active player, next active player, multiplayer. With Charles going on the stack first, then Bryan, then Marcos. When we go to resolve these items, we do so in reverse order. And we ask, do you pay the 1, starting with Marcos?
Do you pay the 1?
Heck no.
Do you pay the 1?
Heck no.
Hold on, Charles. This is
I know what it is. I still say no. That's the answer. I want them to pay. I don't play Rhystic Study. This is rude.
Yeah, we're asking the wrong player to talk about how he wants to work with his own Rhystic Study here. This truly is nightmare fuel for Charles specifically. All right, so when all players pass priority on the topmost spell or ability on the stack, then that ability or spell will resolve. Everyone passing priority with an empty stack ends the current step or phase, and the next one begins. We go into more detail about this in the Steps and Phases of a Turn episode coming up soon. There are some things that might seem like they use the stack, but they actually don't. So for example, effects don't go on the stack. Effects are the results of spells or abilities, and those went on the stack, and the effects happen after they resolve, or as they're resolving. Static abilities don't use the stack. They're just always continuously checked. Mana abilities don't go onto the stack and cannot be responded to. Same thing with special actions, turn-based actions, state-based actions, and even things like players conceding a game and basically just players taking their stuff and going home. That doesn't really use the stack. You just do it and everybody looks at you sad.
The next zone is the Exile Zone. The Exile Zone is essentially a holding area for some objects kind of off to the side of the game. Some effects send objects there without any way of coming out of the Exile Zone, while other effects will send the cards there temporarily or conditionally. In the way before times, this was called the Removed from Game Zone, but they kept using it as part of the game, and eventually they realized that a Removed from the Game Zone for a zone that the game was actually using was a really bad name.
As the Exile Zone is a public zone, the faces of most of the cards are visible. However, there are some effects that exile cards face down. In those cases, you cannot look at the face of those cards unless the effect exile them tells you you can, by either having you look at a card before exiling it, or tells you can look at it after exiling. Bomat Courier exiles but does not let you look. Gonti, Lord of Luxury, lets you look then exile. Decadent Dragon has you exile then look. Face down cards in exile should be kept in separate piles based on when and how they were exiled. When the game tells you to do something with face down cards in exile, it is just talking about those specific face down cards and not some other face down pile.
Yeah, usually the best way that people do that is they just exile them underneath the card that instructed you to exile them, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
Now, if an object has one ability printed on it that causes one or more cards to be exiled, and another ability refers to the exiled card or cards, these abilities are linked. The second ability refers only to cards exiled with the first ability. You cannot do any copy shenanigans to mix and match abilities with other cards. For example, with the card Agatha's Soul Cauldron, the ability that states creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron kind of explicitly calls out that that ability is linked to the next ability that says tap, exile target card from a graveyard. When a creature card is exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So here, only cards that are exiled with that last ability of Agatha's Soul Cauldron can be referenced by the second ability on there that gives the activated abilities to the creatures with the counters.
Next up is the command zone. Yes, the command zone is also a holding place for the game, although it's typically reserved for weird stuff like commanders, but also plane chase cards, conspiracies, and it serves as the place that emblems from planeswalkers are created. In general, the command zone functions as a exile zone for very specific things.
And now let's talk about the anti-zone. No, we're not going to really talk about the anti-zone because the game no longer recognizes it. However, there are some cards that will have the word anti on it, and if you ever come across them in the game of Magic, just know that they are banned or restricted from the format that they're being played in unless it's some kind of weird shenanigan unbanned format, and then I don't know what to tell you.
So that's all the normal zones that you're going to encounter on a day-to-day basis as you play a game of Magic the Gathering. But the way these zones interact with each other can be interesting, so let's talk a little bit about changing zones. Objects change zones all the time. When we cast a spell, it goes from our hand to the stack to the battlefield. When creatures die, they go from the battlefield to the graveyard. Most of the time, this is pretty straightforward. However, some events and effects can make this more complicated and affect how cards move from zone to zone. Leyline of the Void and Darksteel Colossus would change where a card would go.
When a card changes zones, it becomes a new object with no memory of its previous existence. A card in a graveyard that had counters on it when it was on the battlefield doesn't keep those counters. A spell returned to the hand doesn't remember what modes were chosen for it when it was on the stack. Being considered a new object is what allows flicker effects to save a creature from a destroy effect. It went into exile briefly and then came back, and when it did, it was a different object, and so the original spell was no longer targeting it.
But there are 12 exceptions. Several of them are very uncommon and only apply to a narrow set of cards. Since we are focused on getting you to L1, we are just going to look at the ones you might need for your L1 exam. A good rule of thumb, though, is if you come across a card that only works if it has an exception, it probably has an exception. Okay, let's dig in.
If a spell, activated ability, or triggered ability changes the characteristics or controller of a permanent spell on the stack, that effect will continue to apply to the permanent that spell becomes. Now, this rule applies to memeably bad cards like Pure Lace, but also applies to effects like Invert Polarity. In Pure Lace's case, you can change the color of a spell or permanent, and therefore when that spell becomes white, as it enters the battlefield, it will also be a white permanent.
An ability of a permanent can reference information about the spell it used to be, including what costs were paid to cast that spell or what mana was spent to pay those costs. There are certain cards like Anna Battlemage and Gadwick the Wizened. They just wouldn't make any sense if they didn't have this. For example, Gadwick the Wizened is X blue blue blue, and it has an ability that says when Gadwick the Wizened enters the battlefield, draw X cards. If we didn't have an exception here, Gadwick being a new object when it enters the battlefield, wouldn't be able to reference what X was when it was on the stack. So again, if it doesn't make any sense, it's probably got an exception.
Abilities that trigger when an object moves from one zone to another can find the new object that it became when it moved to that zone, provided the zone was public. This one actually comes up so much you might not even think it's an exception. For example, Aclazotz has an ability that says when Aclazotz dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. Technically, that death trigger happened while Aclazotz was on the battlefield, and the Aclazotz in the graveyard is a new object. Without this exception, its death trigger couldn't find the Bat God.
Say Aclazotz 3 more times.
You just love that, don't you?
Yes.
There are other exceptions similar to this. For example, auras that trigger when the enchanted permanent changes zones can find the object it used to enchant, and can even find itself if it's put there because the aura went to the graveyard as a result of the not being attached to anything state-based action. If an effect causes the zone change, it can find the objects in the new zone. And if a cost causes a zone change, the effect can also find the objects in the new zone.
All right, there's still other exceptions, but they're not needed for L1. And again, if you run into any non-convoluted, non-contrived situation where the card just wouldn't work without an exception, it's very likely that it has one. So rest assured, you can't necessarily get yourself into a problem with this.
Yeah, Magic doesn't want you to lose the cards.
And that's everything about zones.
Once again, we would like to thank Judge Foundry for their support in sponsoring this series for helping you earn your Level 1 certification. Make sure to visit judgefoundry.org and click on the orange Become a Judge button to learn how you can join the Magic judging community in the US and Canada and earn your certification with Judge Foundry.
Okay. Join us next time as we dive into our next topic for earning your Level 1 certification, the golden rules of Magic and general terms you need to know. And if you want to reach out to us, we have our own Discord server for judges new and old, fans, and anyone who supports the judging community. The invite link to our Discord is in the description below, as well as to our JudgeCast website and individual social media links. If you're a fan of our content, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel and ring that bell to be notified of when new videos in the series are posted or when a new episode of our full podcast is released. Check out our playlists for a complete playlist of this entire series, as well as a Learn to Judge playlist with episodes from JudgeCast's history focused on helping you to become a better judge. And as always, you can find everything related to JudgeCast at judgecast.com. With that, I'm Charles Featherer, and I keep it fair.
I'm Marcos Sanchez, and I keep it fun.
I'm Brian Perlman, and I stay attached to an object in a public zone as it moves to another public zone.
You're a sticker?